compared to watching somebody, run themselves down a cliff into a train or something like that on their skateboard. That's more compelling. And so as a consequence, social media is propagating extreme fringe content and also segmenting us into silos and bubbles. Now, in terms of the second aspect of authoritarian practices, the aim of authoritarian practices is social control. Again, here, there's a perfect congruence between them. The companies are essentially private proxies for social control, highly congruent aims. And this is why the China model is flourishing right now. If you look back 20 years, most observers around digital media and politics said a country like China would never be able to sustain itself given the fast-paced nature of digital technologies. Well, what's actually happening is the opposite. They're beginning to perfect a model of social control that is also economically viable. A great example of this is their so-called social credit system, which companies are very eagerly signing on to. Companies like Alibaba, for example, see this as a huge revenue generator. Social credit system in China is about taking all of the analytics, all the machinery of analytics, and all of the data that's left behind citizens, analyzing everything they do, predicting behavior as a mode of social control, creating a structure of incentives to make it impractical or undesirable to speak against the system or to do things that violate the control of the regime. And it's working. It also used to be the case that Silicon Valley companies had these principles where they would claim we're never going to cooperate with authoritarian regimes. And I can remember specifically Google. I actually had a conversation with Serge back in 2009, 2010, when Google pulled out of the China market. And it was quite astonishing for a company to take that step at the time. Fast forward to today, Google, it came to light through investigative reporting by Ryan Gallagher at The Intercept, that there was a plan inside Google called Operation Dragonfly to create a custom search engine for the Chinese market. They're planning to re-engage. Apple has done the same thing. They've, in spite of all of the ways in which they portray themselves as being a company that is for consumer privacy, when it comes to the China marketplace, they're doing the exact opposite. Twitter, of course, same thing. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, traveling to China, etc. They're all, in spite of their personal principles, let's call it that, there's an inexorable logic that the companies cannot avoid, which leads them down the path of cooperating with companies like that. So the third uncomfortable truth is that the personal data surveillance economy is perfectly compatible with authoritarian practices. So let me conclude by saying, what do we do about this? First of all, let me clarify, if this isn't obvious already. Of course, there are many exceptions to the rule that we could point out. The mere fact that we're all here together, talking in the way that we are, shows that we live in a relatively free society. That's obvious. There are many benefits of the technologies that surround us, including the algorithms and the big data economy even, that I think are beneficial to society and are actually essential to the survival of the species moving forward. But if we continue in the direction that we're going unabated, I think human rights will be eventually squelched. And we need to think about that in terms of the long-term structure of not only the society and the politics we live in, but the economy as well. So what do we do about it? Well, one thing you might say is, well, we need a revolution. Let's overturn this mode of production, get rid of all of these companies, and start again. I think not only is that impractical, it's very dangerous. That's not what I would recommend. Instead, we need a type of pragmatic reform. We need to start thinking differently about how we consume. We need to think differently about our relationship to the data we give away. We need a kind of stewardship over the digital ecosystem around us, where we're not just blindly giving away data to these companies and allowing them to shape us. And I think this will require ultimately a different approach to consumption. Something analogous to the environmental movement, for example, where long ago it was quite novel to say we should start reducing, reusing, recycling. Now it's very common. I think in the same manner we have to start thinking about reducing the volume of information and the number of applications that surround us. And we need to also have new forms of restraint. Privacy laws like GDPR, I think, are a good example. We need to exercise antitrust, break up some of these companies. We also need watchdogs. We need greater oversight and undersight. The work of the Citizen Lab, I think, is a good example of undersight, as I call it, from below, watching the watchers. And we also need the adoption of, or the promotion, the restoration, I would say, of critical literacy towards the world around us. How to discern fact from fiction, truth from falsehood, which ultimately rest on some basic principles around objectivity and rationality that are being squelched as the humanities and the social sciences are being eliminated from higher education. So these are big adjustments, but they're not a wholesale transformation. In any event, I will end it there and look forward to having a discussion with Serge. Thank you again for coming here.
So thanks, Ron, for kind of painting this somewhat gloomy picture. And I mean, you recommended that we need to change something. That, say, I'm looking at these monitors. Nature looks more natural on those monitors than it actually does when I'm out there. How can we do this in an everyday thing? Like, how can we teach the kids that, hey, it's actually not the monitor, that's reality?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I didn't even get into the whole issue of virtual reality, things like deep fakes and so on, simulated realities that surround us, which are a form of distraction, ultimately, that are also very addictive, are also dual functions. So increasingly, the monitor that we're looking at is meant to entice us to stand here and marvel at the beauty of the scenery. But these televisions also watch us now. They're looking back at us. They're sensing that we're here. Facebook has algorithms that look at attention spans as you're scanning a post to see what is it, where do your eyes move. So it's looking back at you. That's why I think we need to do more than just educate people about this. I think we need to start thinking about the nature of the economy around which all of this is based, which is a much larger problem. But in terms of children, the education is important, and I really worry, being a university professor, I see the humanities and social sciences and philosophy departments being increasingly winnowed away in favor of departments and faculties that are about creating jobs. And of course, part of that has to do with the fact that the private sector itself is investing in institutions, educational institutions, and wants to see some payoff from it. So it's a tough challenge. It requires a wholesale move forward.
This really spawns bridge to kind of my next questions. In our hearts, in my community, we all scientists and engineers, and we always say, oh, technology is not bad or not good. It's but what's the responsibility of engineers building all these systems? Because all these are tech companies. They're not kind of finance companies where we have the old enemies of our which it's all engineers. Can they do something? Should they be doing something?
So, most definitely they should be doing something. I was heartened to see that there was a movement within Google. Engineers were resigning or not accepting jobs at Google on matter of principle. That's very good. But how do you cultivate that principled approach to engineering? Again, I think it starts in terms of the education system. If you look at the typical curriculum in computer science and engineering, there is maybe one course, maybe a half course. Usually it's called something like Computers and Society, where ethical issues are dealt with very summarily. But the vast majority is around technical functional literacy. That's obvious to me that this needs to change. And I think the opposite is the case as well. In the social sciences and the humanities, very rarely are students introduced to technical topics in a meaningful way. And yet, in order to be able to navigate the world around us, understand what's going on beneath the surface, we need people who are fluent in the technology. So I think the disciplines themselves and the way that they're structured are an artifact of a prior time. And they're not like fixed in nature. It's not like we have to have things organized that way. I think we need to start thinking about a wholesale transformation of the distinction between disciplines and faculties.
So, Canada and Switzerland have something similar in the sense that they're actually kind of tiny countries surrounded by big countries. Canada at least has a lot of space. We don't even have that.
We've got a lot of space.
But I also think this is one of the reasons. I think there's a reason that Citizen Lab is in Canada, not in the US. That doesn't really surprise me.
Can I just say, some days it doesn't feel that way when, if you see the reaction of my government to some of our work, I'm not so sure sometimes. But I get what you're saying. Yeah. I couldn't do the work that I do in Russia, that's for sure.
So my question would be, what would you advise me to a place like Switzerland that solely kind of banks on brain power of its citizens, and that's the thing we have, the resource we have? What should the country do? What's the environment it should try to create to kind of be successful in a good way?
Yeah. So I think the best way to answer that question would be thinking about it, narrowing it down a bit and talking about cybersecurity, let's say. So what should these countries do with respect to cybersecurity? Because it relates to the topic that we have been discussing here as well. I think right now the dominant approach to cybersecurity is to look at the problem as a national security issue. And when you look at a problem as a national security issue, that brings on board all sorts of assumptions and institutions that go along with it. So secrecy is privilege, hierarchy, classification, military and intelligence agencies tend to predominate, and they come at the problem with a specific mindset. To me, it's crazy that we think about cybersecurity in this fashion because of the way in which this technology so deeply surrounds us and how we're immersed in it. It's really a civic issue. It should be thought of more as a public health issue. So if there's something that Canada and Switzerland could do together, it would be to draw from our tradition of human security. This is a tradition, I think, that's not always the dominant tradition. Certainly not in Canada anymore. We had a foreign affairs minister, Lloyd Axworthy, who was going around promoting this in, when was it, Daniel, in the 90s. And maybe our current government would claim to adopt a human security approach, but they don't always practice what they preach. And I think this is something that unites Switzerland and Canada, is we could start promoting more of a civic-minded, human-first view of how to secure the space around us. If you take that approach, inevitably the topics that I've been discussing here around the nature of the economy and the way in which this behavioral modification is occurring that is actually diminishing the exercise of rights would be a part of the conversation.
So it's, I mean, this we use the notion of a digital peace or digital freedom that we need to regain, and I guess peace and freedom are always something that doesn't come for free. It needs work. You have to demand it. You have to oppose it. I think that's a challenge for each and every one of us.
Yeah.
I'd like to open the questions to the audience. So, any questions from your side?
This one there. Yep.
Thank you very much. I have a question about, you're talking about countries and nations, but I live here, and as far as I know, there's not much political movement or public discussion of these issues. Do you have any thoughts about that, or what happens in Canada or other places?
You mean the comments that I made, there's not much public discussion around that?
Well, you talk about nations and the parties that sort of are in charge in most of those countries, they don't make this an issue. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think, as I said, the way I think about these, they're truths, meaning they're kind of self-evident to a lot of people. I think nothing I said would be all that surprising to anybody, but they're very uncomfortable. I think people don't want to squarely address the fact that we're addicted to social media and what that actually means. I include myself. It's something that is becoming increasingly difficult to escape from and detach from. You know, there is this kind of movement. I notice now people say, I'm taking a day off Twitter, I'm going to give up my Facebook account. Even if you do that, it's really like a Band-Aid kind of solution to the problem. Same with when Zuckerberg and other executives of these companies were called before Congress. They have their hands slapped because something bad happened as a result of their platform. They promise that they will do some alteration, modification around privacy protection. If you look at it historically, they've made those claims consistently while also digging and drilling deeper and deeper into our thoughts, habits, behaviors, social relationships. There's no way that these privacy protections can amount to anything when at the heart of what it is that you're doing is surveilling people, right? That you can't escape what is at the heart of this economy. You can make some minor adjustments. So I think the reason the conversations aren't happening is frankly because it's very uncomfortable. It's a convenience that we enjoy. We kind of like it. That's why I say we consent to it, but not necessarily wittingly. Shall I?
Thanks for your presentation. I have some questions. I try to form it, make it complicated. But actually, the peace, I want to talk about the peace. The peace is never such easy as it sounds. It's always have a very, very high price. Mostly people, normally when people enjoy peace never, the people mostly never understand what's the back. My question is, for example, it's when for the ICT, I remember in the Droz, it was the blockchain headquarters. A lot of young people talk about this kind of freedom, peace for the world. If it's a good thing that everyone knows the so-called truth, all the people believe they know the truth, or is that some elite people or some small group, they rule the country and let normal people understand they would like to understand. I mean, the different way. For example, like you mentioned, whatever China or US control the information flow, and a lot of people just be fooled. Or is that, but somehow its surface is peaceful. Or people think I know the truth, I do some action, I do some movement, make a lot of chaos, but people think they know or they fight for this kind of, the left and right conflict, one is peace, but maybe actually I want not really know the truth. Another is people think they know the truth, but actually it's much more chaos. Or whatever for the country, or for the social, or for the mass side.
Did you have a specific question? I found what you say very interesting, but I just want to know, is there a question underlying it?
For example, you compare Switzerland and Canada, also a very peaceful country, but actually also the country gave up a lot of things, like Canada. You gave up a part of your authority because you don't sign the NAFTA, the new agreement, because you're not allowed somehow to do something with another country. You need to ask the permit from the US. And this kind of information, how you compare with nowadays situation?
Well, I don't know if this will be a satisfactory answer, but I kind of have a reaction to what you're saying. On one level, there's a kind of comfort zone for a lot of people living in a society where their freedoms are actually constrained, because things are more comfortable. It's only when you do something that speaks truth to power or diverges from what is the main form of social control that you get punished. And I think that's a scary prospect if that's where we're headed. There is also, I would say, something very important about how the social media platforms actually exacerbate social tensions and sow divisions. I think this is obvious, at least to me, that that's an outcome. And it partially explains why we are seeing such antagonistic politics right now, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. You have polarity and extremes being amplified. And that has to do with the fact that we've created this system that pushes people in the direction, first of all, of bubbles, people they feel comfortable with, so you get this echo chamber effect. That's well documented outcome of social media algorithms. And also pushes extreme fringe content. So those two together actually hold out the prospect of sowing enormous division in society that can lead to violence. And that serves the interests of authoritarian practices, because authoritarian practices want to come in and stamp that down. Say we have to take extreme measures to prevent this from happening. So they're complementary in that regard.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, as a fellow Canadian, welcome.
Thank you.
One of the things about social media and technology that's been kind of concerning is I know that's what I want to ask you, is what do you think are the future, or actually current ongoing implications of technology on our biochemical identity, like as a species?
Yeah.
Since we're prone to evolve,
Yeah.
and technology is evolving much quicker than we are, because as you say, it's about controlling our patterns and our behaviors. What do you think can be some of the...
So I look at it differently. That's an interesting, very interesting question. I don't know if I have the capacity and the knowledge to answer it in a way that you might like. Maybe Serge has an opinion on this as well. But can I just say something though? You said we're evolving, and I think actually we are evolving, but very, very slowly. The communications environment is moving very quickly, on the other hand. What's interesting to me is that the success of social media and what the aim of social media to do, as I've described, actually takes advantage of some primordial instincts that we haven't evolved away from. So a lot of it draws upon our emotion, our, for lack of a better term, our kind of animal instincts, and which is, when you think about the idea of rationality, I mean, I'm not a positivist, I'm just talking about small r notion of rationality. This at the core of it is this idea that we need to constrain our emotions, our kind of instincts and natural urges to come at a problem with a form of a sensitivity and a mindfulness. Social media actually cultivates the opposite, and that's a big problem. I know that doesn't quite answer your question about the biochemical part. I also worry about that because, of course, the inexorable logic that I talked about when it comes to personal data surveillance leads inevitably to biochemistry. Look at the companies that are selling DNA sampling and that sort of thing. This is about understanding more and more about you down to the level of genetics. And why? In order to shape your behavior, push advertisements towards you, and control you as a person.
So then that raises the question, and this is the last one. Is it a debilitation process of our evolution, or is it actually pushing us into like Blade Runner, like where we become the machine?
Okay, well,
we're practicing this, right?
Yeah.
Every day, every click,
So I think standing in the shadows of all of this is something that is really going to depress everybody. So I hesitate to bring it up, but I'll smile while I bring it up. That'll be okay. Honestly, I think when you add it all up, we are pretty much doomed when it comes to. Well, the climate change issue is standing behind all of this, and the direction that we're headed is looking pretty grim, unless we take some radical measures to alter our collective organization and awareness. And ultimately, honestly, the reason I do the work that I do, although it seems far removed from it, is because of that imperative. If we are going to rescue ourselves and turn things around, we are going to need a communication system on a global level through which we can communicate and share ideas and also monitor the planet, monitor ourselves. So I'm not saying all surveillance is bad. That's not it at all. What I'm talking about is this particular economy that we live in and the political and social outcomes related to it. If we continue in the path that the logic of that economy is taking us, we're doomed.
Yeah, because it's like pleasure and profit, pure.
Right.
That's it.
I had a question over there.
Serge, thanks. Lots of interesting questions. Just to the person who talked about biological issues in the new possibilities of AI. You probably have been talking about CRISPR-9 and the options that we can change and alter our genetics to get them more optimized. And I think it involves a lot of interesting questions how we can evolve and develop humankind. But one thing that I realized in our discussions about the options that we have with the digital change is that very few times we are discussing that we are sold a system that seems to better our life conditions, but indeed maybe what we win and what we gain is not really a win. We are normally sold all these options that they would change our lives better, but maybe the change of value would be the basis which would be much more important. So if somebody has a chance to walk at this lakeshore and experience the nature, it's still a much better experience than as he just looks at the picture. Yeah. And I guess the big danger that we're going to face is that we're going to have a discrimination of people who will still be able to buy the ticket to go there.
Yes.
And the other ones are just going to be able to watch it.
Yeah.
But to watch it is sold in a way that it seems to be a better experience. And there is the big shift between the commercial interests of all these companies who are trying to sell us new technologies as an advantage. Yeah. Indeed, it's a loss. So and I wanted to ask you, what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're effectively, I agree with you, you're restating my thesis, in other words, I think. Another way of looking at this, a different example, would be the sense of community that a platform like Facebook promotes. Again, there are two levels here. On one level, it is a sense of community. My mother, who's 92, is on Facebook, and she can see all of her grandchildren, and she connects to them and so on. But and the platform is designed in a way to make the platform itself invisible. They actually design it. Their aim is to make you think that Facebook's not part of the equation, right? They make themselves as invisible as possible. Why? Because at a deeper level, what's going on is not community. It's a very shallow sense of community. It's about surveillance, right? right? It's about watching everything you do in order to monetize the surveillance of your behavior through advertising. And so if we think that's a sense of community, ultimately we're fooling ourselves. And we're losing increasingly what a real community means. And there are philosophical problems with what I'm saying, I understand that. Real, truth, etc. We could get into a discussion of epistemology if we wanted to, so I'm using these as a kind of pragmatic shorthand way of saying that there's something authentic that is core to who we are that is increasingly lost if we get down this path.
That's what I was saying.
Maybe
It's authenticity being lost.
No, Serge, maybe there's another question. If you're facing the fact that big, huge changes is going to happen in these countries where a lot of people that did not yet even get to the point where they can decide what options they have. If you're watching these developments where millions of people actually are still going to try to enter this world that we are already trying to leave. So how do you think we should help them to maybe not make the same mistakes that we are doing?
Well, I think it's unfortunately very grim, because the vast majority of people who are coming online today are coming from countries that don't have a long tradition of respect for liberal democracy and human rights. Just a fact. And right now, the world is sliding back into authoritarianism, most likely connected to what I'm talking about, at least in part. So the technological developments that will happen among the generations to come look predetermined in a pretty grim way. And again, I just say, look at what's going on in China right now, and how the Chinese model is not just something contained to China as well. It's propagating throughout Southeast Asia, into Africa. Other countries see it as a very desirable model as well. Elites in business see it as desirable, as prosperous. So there is a very dangerous congruence between the dominant model of the economy and authoritarian control that will be very hard to contain in the future.
Yeah, so I would really second that, but on a somewhat brighter note, I still think it's up to us to take our future into our own hands. Just think, you hang out an evening in front of TV, do you feel good? Probably not.
Depends on the show.
It depends on the show, but usually the good shows last for an entire evening.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it starts. And then the next time you go to a store, maybe you think, is it worth to buy the cheapest t-shirt that's made by some inmate in a Chinese prison? Or is it maybe worth, in the old days they had the same kind of think global, act local, and I think we need to translate that into a digital age and really regain our digital freedom. Ensure that we have the human rights valid in cyberspace too.
Yeah. One part of this, I mentioned this very briefly, this idea of stewardship over our data, I think is essential to recovering some authenticity and integrity and freedom. So this idea of not signing terms of service or not understanding where the data goes that we leave behind us. One good place to start would be to encourage people to understand where their data goes. That's why I think things like the GDPR are important, because what it does is it regulates companies that they must tell you what they're collecting about you. It gives citizens and consumers the right, the authority really, to say, let me see everything that you've collected and tell me who you're sharing it with. So that is an act of kind of individual authority over the data environment. I think is one way we can think about a step. So I think Daniel's approaching us.
Yes, we unfortunately have to end. And thanks a lot, Ron, for
I appreciate it. Yeah, well, thank you all for coming out, and I hope I brought you all up. And
just a second. I would like to do another pitch, because you mentioned both. I raised the question of education, technologists to be able to talk about ethics, social scientists talk about technology. So we have this event is co-organized between ICT for Peace and the Zurich Hub for Ethics and Technology. And at the heart of that organization, it's a Verein in Zurich, is exactly that that these two communities meet and discuss and start to understand each other's language. And one aim is that we create, for instance, at ETH in Zurich, which has fantastic technologists and produces so much technology that can be for good, but also for bad. And so we are proposing that ETH is also introducing a chair on ethics and technology. But there are other areas. I mean, biotechnology was mentioned, and health, and so. So we would like to invite you to join this association, Zurich Hub for Ethics and Technology, because we have ETH, we have the university, but we have also Disneyland, we have IBM, we have Google, and I think Twitter is coming and so forth, Facebook. So this is an invitation. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks very much for both of you. And thank you very much to give back to the Zurich Hub for the ZFF for having us here today. Thank you. Bye-bye.